Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning to talk about art museums and contemporary collecting practices. My name is Eloisa Rodriguez, and I'm a PhD student at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester, and one of the organizers of today's event, together with Stace Kennedy, a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and Federica Mira, PhD student at the Birmingham City University. First of all, I would like to thank AHRC and Midlands for Cities for funding this event and the School of Museum Studies through its Center for Researching the Institutions of Art, RIA, for hosting and really encouraging this event to take place. Before we get started, I just want to provide some housekeeping information. A reminder that the event is being recorded. We ask you to keep your mics and cameras off throughout the day. Um, the event is also being live streamed on YouTube. So if you have any issues with Zoom, you can follow the event on the link we're going to post now in the chat. Live transcript is also available, which you can switch on and off using an icon on the bottom of your screen. And as we are relying on technology to run this event, please bear with us if anything goes wrong on our side. And if you have any technical issues, please address them directly to Ashley Barham. She's kindly helping us today with those technical issues. Well, housekeeping done, I have to say that it's great to finally see this event happening, which was supposed to take place in May last year. But with the pandemic, it's almost needless to say we had to cancel it, and now we moved it into an online platform. I guess the advantage of being online is that more people from different geographical locations are able to attend it. So also, if you want to share in the chat where are you from at the moment, it would be great to know where everybody's based at. Um, we want today's event to be honest and open conversation in a safe space where everybody can share their thoughts on art museums and contemporary collection practices. There are many questions that can arise from the subject. For example, how museums actually make their decisions to acquire artworks. How can museums increase their networks to ensure collections are more inclusive and diverse? Can contemporary collecting practices be used to do the colonial work in museums? And how can museums overcome limited budgets? And after this past year, how the impact of COVID, um, how COVID will impact collecting practices. And there are many other questions that we hope to cover today, knowing, however, the limitations of time and space. To address these issues, we then organize these events in three parts. The first part, we will have three wonderful speakers sharing their experience, projects, and perspectives on the subjects. The speakers are Eleni Ganati, she's curator at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens and a PhD candidate here at the School of Museum Studies. Dr. Lucy Bailey, she's currently postdoc researcher at Tate and on the project Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in Museums, and Nikita Giel, curator in training with the International Institute of Visual Arts, INIVA, and Manchester Art Gallery, working on the project Future Collect. The second part will be the roundtable conversation, which will be moderated by Dr. Isabel Whitelag, who is the director of postgraduate research here at the School of Museum Studies. Joining us in this conversation at the round table are also Uthra Rajipogal, independent curator with a specialist interest in South Asian textiles, and Yang Chen, a final year PhD candidate here at the School of Museum Studies, whose research focuses on museums without collections in Japan. The third and last part is the open Q&A. We encourage you to keep the conversation going in the chat during the day. And we're going to be monitoring the chat for questions, and we will invite you later if you want to ask, open the mic and ask the questions yourselves later on. So please keep the conversation going, and also use the hashtag #CollectingNow if you want to have the conversation going as well on Twitter. So yes, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Eleni Ganati, curator at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, as our first speaker today. So Eleni, please.
Hello. Hi. I'm really glad that this event finally is happening. So I want to thank Eloisa and everybody else for organizing it. I will just share my screen now. So, collecting contemporary art in the Public Museum of Contemporary Art. Collecting contemporary art within the museum context is, of course, a multifaceted topic, which has many times initiated debate and, of course, a variety of approaches through time. It is a practice that challenges the traditional idea of the museum as an institution focused on the past, as well as of the museal object as a time-tested masterpiece of recognized value. The paradox of the Museum of Contemporary Art, as it has been called, lies in its attempt to preserve the present. This antinomy has often raised skepticism about the practice of collecting. There have been instances when permanent collections were viewed as a burden and were relegated in favor of temporary exhibitions in a constant pursuit of what Claire Bishop describes as the new, the cool, the photogenic. On the other hand, the realizations that permanent collections can contribute to a less presentistic and superficial treatment of contemporary art has grown. Building permanent collections of contemporary art allows us to think in multiple temporalities. It allows us to map and understand the present moment, not as an individual condition, but interrelated to the past and to the future. It urges us to think critically, as it encompasses a series of critical decisions, of inclusions and exclusions. The artwork that enters the public museum collection transitions to the realm of the art historical canon. Thus, through collecting, museums develop narratives. They articulate their own definitions of contemporary art. And as Margaret Talley remarks, through musealization, art becomes heritage. So the question arises, how do public museums of contemporary art collect? Of course, there are many factors, often conflicting, that affect collecting, ranging from theoretical reflections on the changing perceptions of contemporary art to practical concerns about budget or space. Although certain points of convergence exist, the diversity of museums of contemporary art and their approaches to collecting is noteworthy. This is, of course, the result of the particular and unique conditions that govern the history and identity of each museum, because common questions can be addressed differently in different contexts. I think that to approach this question and understand the practice of collecting in public museums of contemporary art, it is helpful to look at their collection policies and place them in context, explore under what conditions these policies were formed, what needs they meet, what concerns they take into account, and of course, what they aim to accomplish. With this in mind, I will use the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, EMST, and its collection policy as a case study in an attempt to shed light to aspects of collecting and to showcase the considerations that this process entails. EMST was established in 1997 and opened its doors to the public in 2000. It is a legal body of private law, non-profit character. It was established and supervised, and it is financed by the Greek Ministry of Culture and Sports. Its foundation in Greece, in a country where archaeological heritage prevails, has been a request of the art world for decades. It came to fill an essential gap in the Greek arts and cultural policy, as Greece was lacking a national institution for contemporary or even for modern art. Building a permanent collection was provided for by the museum's foundation law and constituted a priority for ENS, reflecting the belief that a museum does not exist without a collection. The framework of the museum's collection and the collection policy was described in certain parts of the foundation law, which was issued in 1997, as follows. The museum's objectives include the preservation and promotion of artworks by Greek and international artists, which belong to the history of contemporary art, as well as of artworks of various trends of contemporary artistic production, Greek or international, with an innovative and experimental character. The museum's objectives are fulfilled with the creation of collections of paintings, sculpture, installations and multimedia installations, drawing, engraving, photography, video, audiovisual works, works of other technological mediums, industrial design, and other related objects. This short description that may seem vague and general, it already reflects two of the main considerations that pervaded the Greek art world almost throughout the 20th century. The need to grasp and elaborate historically the terms modern and contemporary regarding the Greek visual arts, and the need to place Greek art in an international perspective. At the same time, the foundation law attempts to ensure that the collection of the new museum can be open to experimentations and new trends. The collection policy was formed in the first years of the museum's operation by the founding director, Anna Kafetsi. Its main principles remain until today. However, the change of director in 2014 and the move to the museum's permanent building in 2015 signaled a shift in its general policy that also affected collecting. I will focus here in the first years when the collection policy was being formed and articulated, and when a large core of the collection was built. So, following the museum's statutory orientations, which implicated a collection open to the present, but also with a historical depth, the collection policy was designed around two temporal axes: the contemporary, starting in the 90s, and the historical, the depth of which reaches up to the second half of the 20th century. Anna Kafetsi pinpoints that this direction, already implied by the foundation law, was further dictated by the peculiar needs that had to be met by a Greek National Museum of Contemporary Art, which was established with a long delay at the end of the 20th century, in the first decades of which the concept of modern and contemporary was formed to be redefined in its second half. The collection policy also stipulated the division of the permanent collection in three departments, according to mediums. So we have the Department of Painting, Sculpture, Engraving, and Three-Dimensional Works, the Department of Photography and New Media, and the Department of Architecture and Industrial Design. The first department was initially further divided in the historical and contemporary collection, reiterating the two temporal axis policy. Over the years, however, this practice was abandoned. The classification of works according to medium seems in a sense discordant with the fluid interdisciplinary status of contemporary art. However, the shapings of the department at the first years of the museum reflected the museum's interest in new media, but also the need to ensure that they will not outweigh the rest of the collection. The existence of a department devoted to architecture and industrial design, which is not common in museums of contemporary art, could be understood in the spirit of openness to artistic disciplines, but also in relation to the lack of a museum for architecture in Greece and the request of the architectural community, more intense in the 90s, for its creation. I should also mention here that around the same time, steps were taken for the operation of a museum for design in Thessaloniki, based on the collection and the vision of Stelios Delialis, but this project was never actually, it was not realized. In accordance with the museum's wider cultural policy, The collection policy, as initially designed, revolves around two key points: the international perspective of Greek art, local and global, the cultural and artistic pluralism, transculturalism, inclusion, dialogue. As a national museum, in many cases, EMST was expected to serve a national narrative of Greek art. However, the collection policy was conceived with the vision of a collection that will enhance the self-awareness of Greek contemporary art through a global prism, that will enhance critical interdisciplinary thinking. It will be open and responsive to discourse and explorations, and will welcome diversity. In more details, the collection's objectives, as expressed in the collection policy until 2004, are as follows: to contribute to the exit of contemporary Greek art from national borders and introversion, to promote Greek art nationally and internationally with an open mind to the most vibrant, advanced, and critical artistic forces and explorations of the country, to offer Greek artists opportunities to create new works, facilitating them with technological infrastructure, promoting collaborations, dialogue, and networking with works, artists, and museums from the international arena, encouraging the critical convergence of the local with the global, to encourage the transcultural discourse of artworks and artists coming from metropolitan centers and peripheries alike, to encourage the equal expression of the diversity of marginalized social and artistic minorities, redefining the notions of identity and otherness through open, transcultural, and ecumenical forms, to highlight explorations, innovative trends, and critical realizations of the artistic present, but also of the historical depth, without prejudices in terms of genre, expressive mediums, themes, national or geographical origin of artists, to invest artistically in young and emerging artists, to develop a core with key works, both historical and contemporary, by internationally recognized artists. Taking a closer look at the collection's objectives, it becomes evident that they reflect the resonances of the demands for renewal and exit from isolation that prevailed the Greek post-war art scene, as well as the self-perception of Greece as a periphery of the Western art centers. However, these ideas are elaborated, digested, and finally encompassed as aspects of relevant, at the time, discussions about the contemporary art and new museological practices. In the light of post-colonial studies, the notion of otherness, transculturalism, and inclusion can be considered among the most current and crucial issues discussed in the 90s and 2000s. It is worth commenting, though, that there is no explicit reference to inclusion in terms of gender, although in practice, female artists represent more than 30% of EMST's collection, and the collection itself explores issues of gender and female identity. This is not irrelevant to the lack of a theoretical discourse on Greek art through the prism of a feminist theory, which is inconsistent with international developments. The intention of the museum to explore advanced and experimental art trends and invest in younger artists may seem contradictory to the interest in collecting key works by internationally established artists. However, it falls within the concept of dialogue and diversity. It is indicative of the museum's self-perception as a supporter and facilitator of art, but it also highlights the need for EMST to be placed internationally in the same level with other museums of contemporary art, to become a pole of attraction for visitors, artists, other museums, sponsors, and donors. As expressed in the collection policy, EMST collects with an open mind in terms of theme, intending to trace the explorations and considerations that occupy the creative thinking. Developing narratives within the collection that deal with current and timeless issues has been important to the museum's collecting practice. EMST acquires artworks through purchase, donation, bequest, and permanent loans. Commissioning new works has also been a way to enrich collections, facilitating artistic production and experimentations. As a newly founded museum, EMST had to build its collection from scratch, having this way the opportunity to construct its own strong and situated narrative and identity. On the other hand, it was faced with the challenge to create at least a core of the collection within reasonable time in order to consolidate its presence, something crucial for its viability in the early years. Considering that contemporary culture has not been a priority for the Greek cultural policy, at least at the time, acquisition budget was a challenge for the museum and a factor that influenced the thinking about the collection policy and its orientation. Anna Cafezzi mentions at the 2005-2007 cultural policy draft that the encyclopedic or selective orientation in the representation of movements, artists, and works depends solely on the available financial resources of the museum, and regarding the historical core, on the rarity of works. The dependence of a balanced growth of the collection on a regular and generous acquisition budget, especially during the first years when the collection was being built, was repeatedly discussed. The realistic approach to inadequate budget was the prioritization of artistic quality over quantity, with quality, of course, meaning works that are relevant to the museum's collection policy. This approach also set the need to avoid a gigantism of collections with the resulting difficulties in managing them. Donations by artists or private collectors have also contributed to the enrichment of the collection. Accepting donations involves certain considerations and ethical dilemmas. In the case of donations by artists, for example, it may conflict with the role of the museum as a supporter of artists. In the case of the long-awaited EMST, however, a large part of the art community was willing to contribute to the foundation of a permanent collection, considering the strong presence of the museum beneficiary for arts and culture in the long term. In that spirit, a purchase-donation combination was applied in the first years when possible. For example, in 2002, the museum received a subsidy by the Ministry of Economy and Finance for new acquisitions. More than 45 artworks were purchased by 17 younger, mid-career and established Greek artists, who at the same time donated more than 40 works to EMST. In any case, the collection policy sets criteria for the acceptance of donation in order to ensure the preservation of the collection's character. The relevance of the collection, the importance or historicity of a work, the potential to fill gaps or strengthen existing cores are some of the most important ones. Thus, the quality over quantity principle was supplemented with the equally basic principle: we accept only what we need. Permanent loans, another debated subject, were also considered in the collection policy of EMST as a way, under conditions, to fill gaps, especially regarding works that could not be purchased for any reason. So today, the EMST collection numbers more than 1,500 works of various expressive mediums by more than 260 artists and art groups, of which more than 40% are international artists. I would like also to mention here that collecting in EMST is not limited to the collection of works of art. EMST features an art archive specializing in contemporary art, which follows its own collection policy. Closing, I have to remark that in the limited time of this talk, it would be, of course, impossible to develop the scope and depth of considerations behind collecting and the factors evident or underlying that influence it. I wanted to discuss some aspects of EMST approach to collecting, hoping, above all, to showcase the polysymous questions that arise during this dynamic and critical process, and the need to acknowledge them and discuss them. And I'm very happy and certain that we will have this chance here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleni. That was really interesting. Just a reminding, we will ask
have a Q&A at the end, so please keep your questions coming in the chat. I'd like to invite now Dr. Lucy Bailey to present her talk.
Thanks so much, Eloise, and thank you for the invitation. I'll just share my screen.
Elaine, you need to stop screen sharing, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you see it all right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great, okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be with you all. So over the next 20 minutes, half of it I'll introduce a project I've been involved in at Tate. And then the second half I want to focus on ideas of learning within collection care, particularly around slowness, that have surfaced from our work with the artist Imrobashi Okon. Just to warn you, I'm currently on maternity leave, so I might have my camera off while I feed my daughter every now and then. So I'm one of a number of researchers working on a 3-year project at Tate called Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum. In the project, as well as myself, there's my colleague Sarah Haylett, who's been working as an embedded researcher in the Library Records and Archives Department. Stephen Heighton is working in collections management and registrars as an embedded researcher. And there are researchers in the time-based media, photography and sculpture conservation departments at Tate. Over the last 3 years, we've had 4 different visiting academic fellows with specialisms in contemporary music, anthropology, museums and new media curation. We're sharing our findings through a programme of events, talks, performances around works as well as online publications. Our research is focused around 6 case studies. 3 are monographic and 3 are thematic case studies. All of them come from Tate's collection or from Tate's history. So these are a performance work by Tony Conrad, 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane, 15 net artworks that were commissioned by Tate between 2000 and 2011, a thematic case study looking at how archives and records live in the museum, another thematic case study looking at the processes of remastering, remaking and reproducing contemporary artworks. 4 acquisitions by Imrobashi Okon, which I'll go into, and this work by Richard Bell called Embassy. And I've just shown this Felicio Buston work, which is part of our remastering, remaking and reproducing case study. So each of these works have been selected because they answer a number of different research questions that we've set out in the initial proposal. So I wanted to go through these, but just to sort of let you know how it works. So the works are nominated based on these research questions, and then they go through an implementation group that consists of managers in the collection care division. And then finally, an advisory group approves the final decisions around the case studies. So the questions that we're thinking about, how might a work unfold over time while it's in a collection? If a work takes different forms, how is variation decided on each time the work is displayed? If we use artist interviews to map alternatives, how do we avoid fixing or containing the work and reproducing sameness? One of our case study looks at the boundaries between archives, records, and artworks. This is particularly pressing in works that are performance-based or in some way performative. Definitions of archival collections like those at Tate are often based on historic ideas of the record and the archive and the work. Performativity challenges this. What if material is generated through an exhibition or a moment of activation? For instance, Tanya Bruguera's Tatlin's Whisper No. 5, one of the conditions of this work, which is a performance piece that you see here, is that each time it's performed, documentation is produced and kept. But is this material artwork in itself? Is it part of the artwork or is it archival? With these questions, an important deciding factor we've been realizing is who it is who's producing the material. Is it, for instance, the artist or the Tate? We're also interested in the idea of unruliness. This is something that comes from the sociologist Fernando Dominguez Rubio after he was researching works at MoMA, particularly works by Namjoon Paik. He notes the difference between the docility of paintings and the unruliness of installations. One example might be net art. Net art is perhaps unruly because of the way that it doesn't easily fit into the museum. It's a development of mail arts, cybernetics, new media art histories, yet it's difficult to display and collect, should there be a physical presence in the gallery. It's also often made by collaborators like programmers, AI experts, designers, many of whom sit out of the framework of art. We've also been asking who is involved in the production of work other than the artist, and whether we're really valuing these histories and individuals as well as the artist. This was particularly true of our research into the work by Tony Conrad, 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane. This was first performed in 1972 in the Kitchen in New York. It's performed by a projectionist, musicians on a violin, an instrument called the long string drone, which Tony Conrad invented, a bass or double bass, and until he passed away, Conrad performed it himself. Now it's performed by a recording of Conrad. The work emerges out of a particular tradition for improvisation and minimalist music. But if we aren't acknowledging and sustaining these practices, how are our histories of art limited? Is it the museum's responsibility to sustain these practices for the future? We're interested in making the invisible visible. This is a question posed through Ellen Pavey's PhD, Making the Invisible Visible in the Contemporary Art Museum, which is part of the project. And it's something that we're thinking about around the kind of hierarchy of knowledge that we have in museums. We know a lot about curatorial practice now, since it sits at the top of the museum's hierarchy of knowledge. But what is the agency role and interpretation of conservators, registrars, archivists, visitor services, security and audiences? Why are some artworks and practices more collectible than others? One way we're starting to think about this is whether some artworks are more exhibitable than others. And are we collecting histories or practices? This is a question that's felt relevant with this work by Gustav Metzger. It's a piece of auto-destructive art, so it's art that was created to self-destruct. In the 2004, this piece of auto-destructive art was recreated for an exhibition at Tate about the 1960s. Is this an example of recreating and collecting a historical moment, or an example of collecting and recreating practice? And does its creation by Tate conservators, curators and Metzger contradict the very notion of auto-destructive art that it was originally intended to demonstrate? I'll put this film in the chat for you. I don't think we've got time to watch it now. So one of the things that lies behind the project and relates to the question of invisibility and visibility is an awareness of a hierarchy of knowledge. Emily Pringle, in her book, Rethinking Research in the Art Museum, notes the institutional and epistemological hierarchies in the museum. The conception of the scholar-curator as the legitimate producer of knowledge remains dominant, with the knowledge of others in the museum seen to be less vital to fulfilling the museum's mission. This affects curators at various levels in the organisation, as well as other individuals, departments and practices. Only certain areas of their work, of these individuals' works, are publicly acknowledged. And one thing that's come up through the project is the way that this hierarchy seems particularly evident when it comes to decision-making processes around artworks. Who makes the decision, who holds the budget. It's also tied to who holds the relationship to the artist. So to address this idea of invisibility and hierarchy of knowledge, we've been looking to a broader spectrum of practices. And one interesting way of looking at this is through the book by Roubier, Still Life, Ecologies of the Modern Imagination at the Art Museum. He looks at the absent voices of forms of labour, taking an approach that is around looking at ecological nexus. He describes this as the material, atmospheric, semiotic and imagined conditions in and through which something, be it a category, body, a rock or a god, exists, subsists and becomes. Recognising labour is part of this ecology and therefore surrounds, it extends to the communities that surround artists and their works. This is something that we've been thinking a lot about and trying to sort of address and find a way through. In practice, it's involved undertaking interviews with artists and thinking through the interpretation and agency of individuals and groups within the works. This is something that we did with Tony Conrad as well as the NetArt case study. It's also something that we've been working with through interpretation teams, thinking about how we might communicate more multi-vocality around our work. With these ideas in mind, I want to now turn to our current case study, Imre Bassi-Ocon, 4 works that are coming into the Tate collection. So as these works were coming into the collection, we felt that they had a very strong resonance with the Reshaping the Collectible project. The exchange between individuals in the museum, including myself and Imre, made present where structures in the museum were becoming restrictive, fixing, and how challenging it might be to reshape these to be responsive to artists and their practices. A key idea that transcended the works and the moment of this exchange was the idea or practice of slowness. Imre Bassi-Ocon has spoken about, as alongside slowness, has spoken about her interest in questioning conditions of artistic production and making visible the gap between labour value and the aesthetic or financial value of a work. The curator Cedric Force refers to this as the politics of refusal. So I'm interested in what it means for the way the works are acquired. Where is value located? And does it translate to a consideration of forms of labour and different practices in the museum? The works that were acquired were all shown alongside another piece at the Chisenhall Gallery in 2019, and then at Void Gallery in Derry in 2020. They were part of an exhibition called Infinite Slippage, Non-Repugnant Insolvencies, tarrying as handclaps of M's hard-loved flesh. I'm irreducibly undone because quantum lineage complex dub. In the exhibition, there were 5 artworks or objects, Mahala paintings, which were not acquired, but you can see at the end of the room there. This line of fans, which was fans repurposed to emit a slow flow of air, as well as another slowed down or chopped and screwed version of a song called Adorn by Miguel. This ceiling consists of tiles that you might find in institutional or bureaucratic environments. These have been coated with ultrasound gel, insulin, and morphine. It has been added beneath the gallery ceiling, creating a purposeful gap or negative space between the gallery itself and the artwork. The shimmering glass lamps you see installed on the ceiling are coated with a liquid consisting of Courvoisier and palm oil. Palm oil particularly is a substance that turns to liquid at room temperature. The works are in part about the body, but where the physical presence or figural presence of the body is absent. They make present our relationship to these materials and objects, our experience of institutional and bureaucratic environments, places we may have sat waiting, places where you might feel invisible. The repurposed objects, the fans, the lamps, the gallery also act as a host to other materials, insulin, morphine, ultrasound gel, alcohol, palm oil, substances we may also have associations with. The titles of the works suggest a performativity. They play with punctuation, terms, numbers. The reading of them feels like a performance or a performative utterance. They're perhaps a prompt for us to do something. In the exhibition as a whole, in the works, there's a sense of slowness. The term tarrying used in the title means to delay, to be tardy, to linger, to abide or stay in. This translated in the exhibition. People apparently spent hours. It's also present in the making of the works. There's the slowing down of the musical track. The liquids on the tiles are also interesting. Ultrasound gel is a way of accessing things that are invisible. Morphine is numbing. It slows things down. Imre Bassi-Ocon has described this as hacking spaces of bureaucracy with stillness. There's also the sense of being inside and outside, the gap between the 2 ceilings, the ventilators, which usually would be outside this gallery space, or just any kind of building. And the gap between the ventilators bringing something in, something fixed, and something that's more elusive, the materials. In an interview with Taylor Lamel, one of her long-term collaborators, Imre asked the question, what happens when you slow down? What do you gain sight of? Slowness is also, as Imre has pointed out to us, about a commitment to learning. So in bringing these works to Tate, this question has also been extended to our practice. What do we gain sight of by slowing down? And to the museum, how does slowness meet the speed productivity from capitalism in the institution? This question felt particularly relevant in a moment of working during the pandemic, when we were forced to slow down and work in new ways, when people's labour and value was coming into question through the museum going through consultation and a number of redundancies. And slowness has felt to be present in other talks. There was a talk by Tina Kampt last year at the Dance Space Project, where she quotes André Lepecki from his book, Exhausting Dance. She talks about mobilizing slowness, quoting Lepecki, "It is not only a question of kinetics, but also generating an intensive field of micro perceptions. So how might we pay attention to these details and create change in practice as a result?" I want to now go through a few works that we're considering and how we're responding to them at Tate. So the ceiling work, which I've described, creates this gap between the gallery ceiling and a new ceiling that's brought in by Imma. One of the things that comes with this is an evolving title. It evolves every time a new tile is added. This proves challenging to the museum's collection management system, TMS, which has a word limit. This is a restriction not from TMS, but from Oracle, an overarching database that TMS uses. The work also requires a continual contact between the artist and the Tate to find out if the piece has grown. This is a problem for interpretation as well. The website has restrictions on the length of a title. How do we manage extensive captions in the gallery? So the answer to this is still unknown, and we're still working through it. But it can be understood at the moment as a refusal to be contained or fixed. It highlights the limitations of structures in the museum. Things artistic concepts are often forced to adapt to fit these structures, like a database or like categories. The idea of the work growing and not fully transferred to Tate also comes through in the contract. That it states that in relation to this piece, no one can purchase the work. This suggests the work is not fixed, but continually growing. And it challenges the idea of what it means to purchase and hold title of a work. Imma has spoken to us about whether we could see this as something that is perhaps a piece that is cooperative and a part of a consortium beyond the museum. With these ceiling lamps, there's this special mixture that's added to them. So a question we have is, how do we replace this in the future without Imma? We've been discussing how this might work with Imma in the future, and perhaps working with others she collaborates with. The final two objects are the fans and the sound piece that come together but are separate artworks. The sound is configured to work with the speed and number of fans that are installed. So we're thinking through how we learn this piece with the artist and how we might work again with her collaborators to think through the piece and its variability in the future. So not all of these works are to do with slowness, but they do encourage us to slow down and gain sight of what might be restricting or fixing in the way we do things in museums. They allow us to stop working on autopilot and to question how we're doing things, to think through the structures we're working in and the effects they might have on the individuals who are involved in the acquisition process. We've responded by acknowledging her network of collaborators and working closely with them. And we've been considering what learning is taking place in the process of acquiring the works, but also the agency of the individuals involved. One of the things that comes up particularly is the practice of interviews, which is often used as a way of understanding the artist's intent. Again, to go back to Rubio, he's explored the artist interview and the problem of how it provokes artistic intent. I'm quoting Rubio now. The museum needs a fixed relation between the artist, her former self, and the artwork to be able to describe and stabilize the property and intellectual rights, as well as to organize the kind of mimeographic labor that an artwork requires. But what if we don't put weight of authority on something like an artist interview and the artist's voice as a fixing point of intention, but instead of course record the artist's wishes, but also acknowledge our own agency and interpretation in the process. This is often excluded in museum documentation. You might have the name of someone on an artwork file, but no record of how decisions were made and where someone's interpretation has been applied. For conservators, Jack McConchy and Libby Ireland, learning the work and her practice has led to a plan to keep track of moments where decisions are made and acknowledge where interpretation and therefore bias may surface. So to conclude, slowness is a refusal to fall into the way things are. We could mobilise slowness. It's a chance to question and reshape not what is collectible, but museum practices and how they affect those who are involved. It's not about perhaps fixing, but letting things breathe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for this incredible presentation. You raised so many interesting issues that I personally faced with my research as well. It'd be great to have a chat later about it. I would love to invite now Nikita for her presentation. And a reminder, please keep your questions coming in the chat and we will address them later at the Q&A. Nikita, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Nikita, and I'm a trainee curator with Innova as part of a project called Future Collect, funded by Art Fund, Esme Fairbairn and Arts Council. And I'm working currently at Manchester Art Gallery. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Is that all fine? Can you see it?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Lovely. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the work that I've been doing in the past year as a trainee with Manchester Art Gallery and Innova. So I'm hopefully going to go through a little bit of background on the project itself, some aims and key issues, approach, challenges, insights and learnings. And I guess where the story begins is thinking about the question of how we together think through obstacles of representation with the creative community that we have of artists, constituents and gallery users. And I refer here to Oliver O'Tell, African Europeans, and in her chapter, Neither Here Nor There, when she speaks about the European gaze towards people of African descent that have been painted. In this context, she was speaking about African Europeans in the Victorian era, but it's highly relevant to the work I'm doing, I think. So I quote, "Clearly played multiple roles in elite identity, serving as plaything, status, symbol, rescuer, benefactor, confidant, and muse, often simultaneously. Positive views that Black people exhibit existed alongside racist considerations. They were the color of sin and had been redeemed through an exemplary life." End quote. And the reason why this quote is quite important to me, especially now, is the idea that representation itself of Black people in paintings in art galleries can often veer dangerously close to virtue signaling for art galleries to celebrate that they have achieved a sense of anti-racism because they have images of Black people in their collections. And I want to know sort of how we can move past that through the work that we do in gallery spaces. So just to give you a bit of background, 4 years ago, the University of the Arts London and Middlesex University took up a bid to audit Black British artists in the collection of public institutions in the UK. And we're thinking about the question of how African and Asian artists in Britain feature in the story of 20th century art. The central concern for the project, Black Artists and Modernism, or BAM for short, was to begin to address the notion of art historical amnesia, as highlighted by Corbina Mercer's essay, Iconography of Identity. As a result of the research project, Hamad Nassar, the curator of the BAM project and now senior curator of the British Art Show that's upcoming, collaborated with curator Kate Jesson from Manchester Art Gallery on a public outcome exhibition called Speech Acts in 2018. And Speech Acts, as we can see here from the question, thinks through the idea of what public museums collect and why, and who holds the power, who can be a highlight in an art gallery's permanent collection on display, and who is sort of forgotten in the history of the collection's storage spaces. So at this particular point in time, Manchester Art Gallery was the site of Sonia Boyce's retrospective exhibition, of which Six Acts was a part. Six Acts is a new work that Sonia Boyce curated with Manchester Art Gallery's teams in 2018. And a starting point of it was a series of conversations about how the gallery collection is displayed and interpreted. And Sonia Boyce and the gallery staff specifically were interested in the politics of class and gender, race and sexuality at Manchester Art Gallery in the 18th and 19th century paintings displays, and were wanting to consider what those galleries meant for today for a full gallery rehang, seeing as the exhibition spaces hadn't been changed since 2002. So as part of that process, there was an evening takeover, and the first of the 6 acts was Lasana Shabaz's performance of Ira Aldridge, a renowned 19th century Shakespearean actor, and it was performed as though stepping out of the portrait painted by James Northcote. Shabaz's performance highlighted a number of opportunities to open up conversation around the image of representation in relation to the painting of Ira Aldridge. As many of you might know, or not, the 6th and final act, addressing the problematic representation of young girls in the painting Hylas and the Nymphs, and the subsequent furor around the painting's temporary removal, significantly dampened the opportunity to delve deeper into the representation and intent of the painting of Ira Aldridge, which was the first painting in Manchester Art Gallery's collection. Around the same time in 2018, the International Institute of Visual Arts, INAVA, held a study day about collections and acquisitions that provided the research that would be developed into the bid for Art Fund and what would become Future Collect, and looking at pivotal exhibition pieces from the past. The questions raised for Future Collect was how we could envision alternative futures for our collections and our exhibitions. So a little bit about the project. Just before I get to that, actually, I just wanted to show you a painting of Ira Aldridge as painted by James Northcote and Lasana Shabaz as Ira Aldridge. And also to highlight that Sonia Boyce's work with Ira Aldridge was preceded by Devotional Wallpaper, which is an ongoing project in which she celebrates and highlights the voices of female singers of Black African descent. And of those names on the wallpaper is Amanda Aldridge, which is the daughter of Ira Aldridge as well, which was exhibited within her retrospective. So, yeah, a little bit about the painting. So it was exhibited when the gallery was first the Royal Manchester Institute in 1827, and collected because it was considered, in their opinion, to be the best executed painting of those calculated for the institution, i.e. the exhibitions that the paintings that were on show at the time. And often a lot of Ira Aldridge's story seems to slip out of memory, I guess, in terms of what's put on display. It's often referred to as the first object in the collection, but what of the man? So he was born in America, in New York, and attended the African Free School, and arrived in England in the early 1800s at 17, and became quite successful as a theatre performer in the regions, particularly in Liverpool, Newcastle, Coventry, and also in Manchester as well. So kind of there's a lot of scope for thinking about how Ira Aldridge as a man can be seen as a source of sort of celebration, and not just as a representation of Blackness within an art gallery's collection. So I'll move on to the BAM project. So in response, the Future Collect project rather. So in response to the BAM project, Future Collect was designed to create a new model that supports the transformation of collecting in British institutions, with each year working with a regional museum to commission an artist of African or Asian descent, British born or based. Crucially, these commissions give an opportunity for an artist to be collected and exhibited by a major British institution, as well as contributing to a wider debate on collections and whose heritage is being preserved. And some key aims of this project. So alongside the commissioning of the artist, one of the other key aims was to cultivate new generations of young people and their families to be self-assured visitors to galleries and museums. So the work that we ended up doing during this last 12 months consisted of an exhibition called Constellations, Care and Resistance, which is kind of a starting point for us in terms of how we communicate with artworks of the past. And Jade Montserrat was chosen as the artist for the first year of Future Collect. And together we exhibited her existing work alongside works from Manchester Art Gallery's collection in the constellation that explored the multiple stories and sparked curiosity and shared memories. Our constellation expands conversations initiated by Jade's practice, which works at the intersection of art and activism through drawing, painting, performance and film, and text, and interrogates our sort of linguistic habits. Jade's work is exhibited alongside Claudette Johnson, Mark Titchener, and Ian Hamilton Finlay. But I'll talk a little bit more about those artists later. I just wanted to stop here on the name of the room. So we called it a constellation because we wanted to think about what it means for us to spark curiosity in audiences, and what ideas they could bring to collections and new stories that we've yet to hear or tell. And we kind of thought about, with such a vast collection, where do you start? So a bit about the artists that were chosen to be in conversation with Jade. There's Mark Titchener, whose work offers sort of a question to Jade's practice, and also to thinking about the idea of care.
I think we lost Nikita. Just bear with us a moment, please.
I think think she's dropped off, Eloise.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to contact her.
Eloisa, I think we were due for a break fairly soon. So perhaps we could take the break programmed, and what I could do is ensure that Nikita has an opportunity to complete her presentation in the roundtable.
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan. So let's do this. Let's have a break now, 10 minutes break.
Yeah, and meantime, we can make efforts to find Nikita and make sure she's okay technically.
Yes, that sounds like a good plan. So
Okey-doke.
I'll see you all back here in 10 minutes. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience with these technical issues. And Nikita, thank you for coming back. Isabel, shall I invite you so we can start our roundtable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Federica, can I ask you to stop sharing? Yes, thank you very much. So I'll hand over to you, Isabel.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Eloisa. And also thank you very much to Eleni and Lucy and Nikita for 3 very thought-provoking papers, but also presentations that contained a lot of insight as well. And I'm just really grateful for your participation. I'm just going to sort of remind myself and those listening how this segment is going to work. So joining us are the 3 speakers, as well as Yang Chen and Uttara Rajgopal, who both responded to the initial call for participation in the roundtable, stating their interest in specific questions for discussion. And joining us too, the organisers, so Eloisa, Stacey and Federica. So the intention is to begin with questions of my own for those who've just spoken, but I will also begin by inviting Nikita first to sort of wrap up her presentation because of the internet problem. And then I'll draw Uttara and Yang into the conversation. And from there, we hope the discussion will build between the 8 participants. But please, as you listen to this roundtable discussion, keep the questions coming in the chat bar so that we can kind of get them together for the final Q&A at the end. So Nikita, would you like to begin just by wrapping up your presentation that was internet interrupted earlier on?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so sorry to everyone.
It's absolutely not your fault, Nikita.
Yeah.
I think the best way for me to sort of continue on is maybe to just quickly share my screen, if that's okay with you all.
Absolutely.
The questions that I have been left with, because they'll be most likely addressed during the segment of the roundtable, which is how do we stop losing what we do? And by that, I mean, how do we guard from institutional amnesia of the collections that we hold for the benefit of public consumption and use? And how do we stop losing our practice of what we do? So 3 key things that I'm hoping to work through in this next coming year as the galleries reopen is decision-making, trauma, and testimony. The idea that institutional amnesia is a significant barrier to that key aim I spoke about of engaging or cultivating young audiences and their families. Because how do you know that you belong in a place? How do you know that you hold the power to have a say in the conversation if you don't know the decisions that are made, if there isn't any transparency about what becomes a collection highlight and what doesn't. How can artists who are integral to collections being developed hold and be given space and room to engage with conversations around institutional racism, systematic racism, structural racism, and how that information can be shared with audiences that gives them the confidence that they too can sort of pinpoint their place within an institution as a visitor or user, not just necessarily as being represented or mirrored in paintings on the wall, but in the actual workings of an institution itself and its policies and its key aims and mission and vision.
Oh, Nikita.
Oh, have I broken up again?
No, you're still there.
Oh, okay, but yeah, so that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Those are really, really pertinent questions, and I'm glad that you're able to return and articulate them. And I was thinking while listening that a point that perhaps all three speakers addressed to some extent is the crucial decision-making involved in acquisition, particularly. At the same time, it's crucial, it's decisive in terms of careers and histories, but very hidden for reasons that may be obvious or reasons that might not be known. And I was thinking when listening to you earlier, Nikita, that can you imagine a future where those that participate in that decision-making might be extended to include precisely the publics that a museum wants to speak to, wants to represent? Is that an idea that maybe in your imagination you might think about, or that you might even think is possible?
Yeah, I think that is a significant part of what I see as a potential futures, because history is not linear, is it? It's everything is happening in a series of fluid movements, backwards and forwards, left and right, round and round. And for example, I talked about storage wars, and what I meant by storage wars is curators going into their collections and just picking a drawer and looking what's in it and seeing what information they have on that object. And a work of art by Claudette Johnson was found through storage wars. And before it was found, it wasn't included on the Black Arts and Modernism audit list at Manchester Art Gallery. So that was a significant piece of Manchester history that was lost, because Claudette Johnson lives and works in London, but she was raised in Manchester. And she also had a relationship with Manchester Art Gallery in 1986, right at the very beginning of the Black Arts movement, of which she was a part of, and right at the very beginning where the first Black Arts Convention happened. And this work that she did with the art gallery was a residency at a local West Indian community centre, which is still active today. It's used for weddings, funerals, anniversaries, but everything basically through the South Manchester Caribbean community. And she painted the residents who came through her community space and exhibited at Manchester Art Gallery. However, there was no evidence of this in the object file. Now, there's a lot of art schools, college up, high school and up, and as a resident of Manchester myself, I was never taught Claudette Johnson as part of my art history. And that's a tragedy. The same way that it's a tragedy that people don't know that Ira Aldridge was the first Black theatre manager in Coventry, in Manchester, in the exhibition where the first painting you come to in the collection is of this man. And to see yourself in a potential future where you can imagine a career in the arts or in theatre or anything like that, it does have to come from that idea of confidence that you can make a decision to move in that direction and follow a line. And I think being more transparent with gallery users, for example, maybe there could be some sessions of Storage Wars that invites our gallery users or constituents to come and do the Storage Wars with the curators, to know that these things are precious, but people are more precious than things, and their stories are more precious, and their stories are more expansive when other people are able to tell those stories.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And yeah, I think that there is this tradition almost that, the collection is so precious that it has to be hidden. The decisions about what's collected are so crucial that they have to be hidden. And I agree with you that I think it's important to be asking these questions and imagining different possibilities and being brave institutionally about experimenting with them. So thank you. I really appreciate your answer. I'm gonna move to ask the other speakers, so I don't forget. There's always a danger I'm gonna get really involved in the conversation. I always talk too much. I'm famous for it. So I'm going to try and avoid that by moving on. And going back to the start to Eleni, and similarly, I know that in your PhD research, the question of how you decide in terms of collecting the contemporary or contemporary art is really central to your PhD research. So I'm really grateful again for your attention to this question. And one of the questions that came to my mind when you were talking, Eleni, was how, in the case of the Museum of Contemporary Art, when the museum sets out to represent the global, how does it have any criteria or any notion of how the global is understood in relationship to Greece or in relationship to Athens? Is there a kind of logic for how the museum might imagine what their international should be? Which again, I think is another issue that is present in museums in many places, that they want to be global and they want to be international, but they don't necessarily want to specify what that means. So I'm wondering what that means in Greece or means for the Museum of Contemporary Art there.
Yes, I think that in the case of EMS, of the Athens Museum, it was a historical need. This, as I said, Greece is well known for archaeology and archaeological sites and everything. So art was always underestimated. When the museum was founded, they had that need, or everybody, I mean, artists, curators, everybody felt that Greek art should leave Greece and go travel outside the national borders, but not to be seen from outside as an art of a periphery, but as an equal art center with them. This was very, very central. Otherwise, the museum felt that the Greek audience had to familiarize itself with what was happening outside. Artists and audience didn't have contact with national development. So that was even historically, because Greece was like in the 70s, getting out of dictatorship. And there was the urge to learn what was happening and feel that they were getting to the same level with international developments. So that was, I mean, that was a historical need for that. Other than that, I feel that the need for the museum to be international is partly the need to attract, what I said, to attract attention, to attract funding. This is a very, very practical thing, but it exists. It's not all about, you know, philosophy. It is about viability sometimes. So these all aspects are there.
Yeah, and I totally agree that it is, you know, in many senses a pragmatic decision, and in the case of the specific history of Greece, this kind of need to re-emerge from a situation of isolation and political suppression is also key to the kind of craving for this kind of connection. So thank you. And you've talked a little bit about this, but in your wider research also, do you get a sense of how, in defining contemporary art before collecting and as part of the acquisition process, that there is a kind of variation in how different museums in different parts of the world might define and approach what contemporary art is, and where it is also?
I think that this is a very a very vital question. And yes, if you take every museum of contemporary art, you can find the differences and the different approaches. I mean, there are, let's talk about how do you define contemporary art chronologically. There are museums that, in the case of Ernst, we define that we collect works from the 60s and onwards, from the 50s and onwards. There are museums that really focus on what's happening today. But I guess this is very, very difficult to define it, because it is it has to do with what you, the moment that you are living in, how you look at the present, how you look at the past, and how you look at the future. Yeah. And when you collect something, when you take it in the collection, you have in mind that this is projected in the future. The collection is memories, the institution's memory. So you think how this will work in three temporalities, which is difficult. I mean, when you're living this, when you're taking the decisions, it is you always have these considerations, and it is difficult to stand above everything and be, you know, not have like prejudices or anything. But I think that's the point of discussing everything. That is the importance of setting the questions, of discussing, of hearing what other people do, what other museums do. And of course, not only what other museums do, but how other fields define contemporaneity and contemporary art. Because this is different as well. I mean, academy has other considerations, while the museal practice thinks a bit differently. And philosophy and all these theories that come in the discussion, like feminist theories, post-colonial studies, and all these theories really do add to this discussion and to the final, you know, collective sense of what we collect and what contemporary art is. So there are points where everything converges, but sometimes they start from different points and they converge. Other times you see that it's completely the opposite.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there is all of it, as you said before, also will meet all of the constraints and pragmatism of an institutional context, which is why thinking about collecting and thinking about this moment of acquisition is particularly interesting, because it is a moment in which pragmatism and money, the two things being connected, really converge. I'm going to move on to Lucy. And so many questions and so many things I was thinking about and noting down. And I think I'm going to try and kind of roll them into one. There's something that you said early on, Lucy, about the project at Tate being concerned both with the collection and with the institution's history, or moments in that history, which I think is an interesting bringing together of two things that are different in a material sense. But in relationship to that, and talking about the notion of cooperation, there are also moments within Tate's collection when its own history and the history of other places collide. So when talking about the acquisition of performance art, often if it's documentation, it's something that was kind of created elsewhere and was fostered elsewhere, perhaps prior to the moment of kind of museum recognition. Similarly with archives, sometimes these are archives of other places. And I was wondering to what extent, and I know you don't speak for the entire project, but it would be interesting to know your views, how thinking about Tate's collection and the very notion of collecting and collectability, how you negotiate this question of ownership when it starts to kind of create relationships between one institution and another, between who is involved in the museum and who's involved in other kind of contexts.
Mm. Well, I think, I was thinking about the Gustav Metzger a little bit, because the work, the autodestructive demonstration that I showed, that was first made in Temple Gallery in the 60s. So that the history of that work has been folded into the recreation of that piece in 2004. So that's an example of what you're saying of two different institutional histories blaring together in one piece. The part of the reason why it's Tate's collection and Tate's history is because of the net art pieces. It's because the 15 net artworks were commissioned, so they form part of Tate's history, but they aren't in the collection. So we've been going through a process of reviewing why net art might not be in the collection, and I've been doing presentations for the curatorial team about those works to see if they could come into the collection. So it's been really interesting to think about the kind of what makes that art form or art practice difficult to collect, and it remains difficult to collect even though it's the first work dates from 2000. So that was part of the reason why it's the institution's history and the collection that I was speaking to, but also part of the initial proposal. There was a kind of checklist that we went through with those research questions. So when any work was nominated from the collection, we'd go through and see, does it raise questions about invisibility or unruliness, or what are the other ones? Does it help us think about artist networks? And then one of those was, does it relate to the institution's history in an interesting way? So that was also why I wanted to highlight that it connects to the institutions, that it's part of the collection that we're thinking about, but also its history. And when you were talking, I was thinking about the Ima Abashi Okon, her ceiling piece is one of those challenges to the idea of a cooperative or a growing work, because she asked us to think about it as cooperative or as a consortium rather than some object that comes into the collection and then is owned and fixed by that collection. So yeah, it grows and it extends beyond that. So we have a part of it, but not the whole. That's a good prompt or question for Tate to have, and for each of our practices involved in the project to be thinking about. Another one I was thinking about was that's a similar idea. Richard Hamilton created this computer work that came into the collection in I think it was 2004. And his idea was that this computer would be a connection for, it would be no, it was much earlier, 1994. It would be the Tate's connection to the internet, and it would be the Tate's sort of network server. So it was before they had the internet. And he, when this computer came in, he said, I'd like this to be the internet source for the museum. But he also, it was an addition piece, so different collections had the same computer, and he wanted to network all of them. So it was the same idea of that the object isn't fixed and contained by the institution, but links up to all of these other networks and collections that also have the computer. So I think these are these nice sort of prompts and questions that come from artists.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that about when you were talking about Emma's work and how it kind of pushes at these conventions that we, you know, take pragmatically for granted about word limits and possibilities of interpretation. And yeah, I think that the thing that's really interesting about the research we're involved in is how, in a kind of possible and in a very possible way, it does kind of push at some of those conventions and open up questions. Again, thinking about institutional history and what it might, how it might actually change the status of the archive, the notion of just what belongs in the collection. And I guess I'm curious to know, and I don't expect you to have the answer, but I'm curious to know how that might change in the future in terms of what is seen to be collectible. And one of the things that is interesting to me is how, for example, the reconstruction of exhibitions is turning exhibitions into something that can be acquired, which is something I find slightly problematic. But I think it's interesting just to think about how our very notion of what an artwork is and what it means to collect it might change. And so I like the way that the project that you're involved in raises those questions in a very thoughtful way.
Yeah, I think a lot as well about the recreation of exhibitions and how they've become collectible at a certain point, and it's interesting to look at when that starts to happen.
Yeah,
the recreation of exhibitions and why that was, and I wonder if it sort of seems a bit connected to the collecting of performance. Of moment of, because I think the first performance came into Tate about 2002, and finding a way of getting instructions and specifications around a performance. I wonder how much that influenced the recreation of those sort of installation performance exhibitions from the 60s, because there were new ways of bringing and making those things collectible. Yeah,
and I also, whether similarly to with Tania Bruguera, whether there are or ought to be certain protocols in terms of how a reconstructed exhibition is collected and re-exhibited, because I believe that in the case of On Growth and Form, which ended up as at MACBA, it's catalogued as an installation, but it's not, is it? And I think that it's really productive, as you were saying before, in the Metz case, to include those kind of layers that mark the time, that mark the distance between one public and another, one moment in history and another.
And it relates to the decision-making question and what's recorded and what isn't. Because
yes, absolutely.
When we went back to the Metzger to look at how that recreation came about and how was the decision made to bring it into the collection, and was Metzger prompted to think about whether this goes back on his idea of auto-destructive art. There were lots of gaps in what had been
Asked.
Yeah, asked, and where interpretation had been made by an individual in the way that it had been put together. So sort of, it was done with Metzger, but how much was imposed by somebody else, prompting, could it be like this? And then sort of been provoking, as Rubia says, of provoking an intention.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, that question of how it relates to or contradicts the autodestructive principle is interesting. And I guess that creates a nice speculative space for someone to imagine what his response would be as well. Great. Okay. I'm sorry to kind of whip around the table, but I want to make sure that we bring in Utra and Yang to the conversation. And both of them have introduced themselves as a response to the original invitation. But Utra, do you want to perhaps introduce yourself and your involvement with the current project with the Whitworth, so that we can bring you into the conversation?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to take part today. So yes, I've actually moved on from the Whitworth now. I'm now in the crazy world of freelance, which I'm very happily bouncing around in. So the project I did for the Whitworth was the Art Fund New Collecting Award, and the project was to collect new acquisitions from South Asian female artists working with textiles and from the diaspora. And the plan is to generate a conversation between these two aspects of culture, because the Whitworth has a strong textile collection, but the South Asian textile collection was largely built on the foundations of colonialism, and that meant merchants collecting samples, buying samples of South Asian cloth to recreate them in the Lancashire mills at a cheaper price to undercut the market in India. And so a lot of the samples that you'll see in the Whitworth's collection are beautiful, outstanding examples, but the names of the communities, the makers, were erased because they were considered to be irrelevant. What was more relevant was the pattern, the weight, the colours, the colour scheme. And it was sort of a systematic form of industrial espionage, if you like. So I wanted to propose and bring to the Whitworth a collection that kind of rebalanced that erasure, that made a point of identifying female bodies as well, female makers, artists, and also to celebrate the cultural identity that has formed within the diaspora that has settled here. And that term diaspora is a loaded term as well, because there are so many individuals within that, and there's a danger of homogenizing the diaspora. But I thought it's a good start. It's not a massive collection. There are not many pieces in the collection because of the funding that was awarded, which was brilliant and very generous, and thank you, Art Fund. And I should also say thank you to my mentor, Dr. Shona Datta, who helped, and of course the Whitworth. But I would like to do more, and so as a freelance curator, I am happily raising the flag and doing more. But I just wanted to say a couple of points that in terms of museums and art galleries collecting and the churning out of these fantastic exhibitions, these exhibitions are temporary, right? And any institution operates in this codependency space between the artist and the audience, and trying to create a narrative of who they are and what they represent. And the institution has a responsibility to leave behind a true snapshot, a true legacy of what society and the issues are faced that surface in artists' work. That's the great thing about art. It is this kind of blank canvas, for want of a better phrase, for bringing to the surface a great many issues that many societies face. And so it's important that the temporary exhibitions have in place some systematic and sustainable way of recording, as we've said, as we've heard the speakers say, but also of building their collection and building the institutional narrative. And I also wonder to what extent curators should be at the top of the hierarchy of knowledge, because curators don't know everything. And if you're dealing with a specialist collection, say for example the South Asian textile collection, you need curators from within those communities, from within those diasporas, those different regions. And I'll give you one example. There was a textile in the Whitworth collection that had been catalogued wrongly and described wrongly as a lungi, which is a type of waist wrap that is typically worn by men. And of course it wasn't. It was a bathhouse towel or wrap. It was a peştemal from Turkey. And so things like that can be, those sort of mistakes will only be realized once you've got somebody with that specialist regional knowledge and understanding of how descriptions are attached to collections and objects as well. So I wanted to say that. And I also wondered to what extent there needs to be a bit more joined up thinking between all these galleries and institutions. I feel that being in the North, big up the North, there's still very much a London-centric kind of lens, or a capital city-centric lens. Oh, let's look at what London or Athens or New York, Washington is saying to understand what the national narrative is. And if every institution is trying to say, we want to be diverse, we want to be inclusive, we want a collection that represents society truly, then why isn't there more awareness of everybody else's collections? Because after all, any institution, any public institution is a collection that belongs to everyone. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in raising people's awareness of that. And, Lubaina Himid once gave a great talk where she was talking about her childhood experience of going around the National Gallery with her mum saying, I own that, I own that, I own that. And we need more people to engage with work like that and collections like that. So when when these questions are being asked about how do we get to this, how do we sustain a collection or build a collection, who is we? That's what institutions really need to answer. Who is we? And you can't just churn out these exhibitions and think, okay, we're going to serve that audience, we're going to do that audience today. No, we don't operate in a society like that. So we need to be more active and consistent and just really take note of the audience on our doorsteps, really. It's not just the audiences who are coming into the gallery. I mean, I grew up in a family that didn't go to any art galleries or museums. We went round to people's houses to eat nice food because that was our culture. We didn't have that culture. So that's what we need to work on.
Thank you so much for those points. As for the first point, the first of the 2 points you made at the end, I completely agree with you that it's really important for, in my view, for museums that traditionally didn't collect art by certain people or from certain places admit the recentness of their knowledge, and that they admit a degree of ignorance as well. Because you're right that, you know, it's a very recent thing, the diversification of, you know, who is represented by kind of Western European, North American collections, and there was an absolute need for consultation, for expertise, but primarily also to admit that there's an extent to which certain histories are still unknown, unknowable, because there's so much work to do. So I do think it's really vital. I agree with you on this point, that as museums change and evolve, they also admit how recent it is, admit that they're developing their own knowledge. I really firmly agree on that point. And similarly, like the classic English problem that we're very, very kind of mono-centered on the capital. And as someone who was born in Manchester, although you would never know it from my voice, I also agree the needs, I mean, I'm very surprised there isn't, I mean, there definitely should be conversation between museums that have significant collections that relate to the same time period within the country. And in some ways, I feel optimistic about that, because I think that there will be a shift for various reasons in how cities relate to one another, for various reasons and according to various demands. But yeah, I totally agree. It ought to be more networked, and also very firmly agree that, you know, it would be, I just think it would be great if some acquisitions were made with consultation with the public, because it would be really messy and difficult. But I feel like it would be such an interesting experiment to understand what the publics that museums might be trying to encourage in, what they actually want. I mean, it might be really contrary to what a museum wants, but I think it would be a really worthy experiment. Yeah, sorry, I don't think it's an entirely feasible idea, but I really like it. And I don't know.
Put myself on mute, being very polite and following the Zoom house rules. But yes, I mean, I love the idea of the public and the messiness. I think we've got to, you know, all the speakers have spoken so eloquently and powerfully about slowing down and really looking at what's going on and how these you know, these institutions are responding. So it's the perfect time to press the reset button and really think about a different model of collecting. And, you know, we live in this unstable internet age. Everything is out there, you know, social media puts everything out there instantly. So I think naturally there will be a greater degree of transparency evolving in those committee rooms and boardrooms as time progresses. I mean, it's only a question of time. Can you imagine? Westminster has cameras in it. Parliament has cameras in it. So can you imagine having cameras at the executive boardroom at Tate or something? I think it'd be fabulous.
I also think that, you know, that maybe major museums who have a lot of stakes, maybe it's just that they will also feel more confident, feel safer in being more experimental, and, you know, that there isn't really anything to fear from experimenting, particularly with this kind of crucial acquisition decision.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add that institutions can get bogged down with their own bureaucracy. And, you know, God bless them for regulation and order, but you know, if because of the shortages and funding and staff cuts, you know, the people who are employed there only have one pair of hands and can only do so much in a day. So institutions, sometimes what you'll face with is this issue of capacity or you know, funding, as Eleni has spoke about. So yeah, there has to be a balance, and I think it comes back to how we value art in society and how we want to see that. Anyway, I'll stop talking and let
and of course, I mean, this is such a fundamental thing at the moment of needing to both be kind of critical friends to museums and absolutely support whatever they do to demonstrate the value of art, from art education to its existence within museums. It's always a bit of a balance to strike, I find, particularly in this country where actually we have very few museums that, comparatively few museums that are like our Museum of Modern Art, our Museum of Contemporary Art. And maybe precisely part of that problem is what you were saying, that what might exist in regional museums in terms of their modern or contemporary collections is quite invisible. And so we don't have like a great competition amongst museums, I would say, either, which you obviously in a larger country like the US, you will find multiple collections, both public and private. I'm gonna move on to Yang now. So Yang, I know that you've got a very specific perspective on museums that opens up another interesting area for discussion, which is the museum without collections, and talking specifically about the context of Japan, and your argument that the museum, or the Japanized concept of the museum, is a museum without collections. And perhaps as a way into your research in that area, to ask you what kind of fills that void in your research into the art museum in Japan, if there is no collection as a kind of focus for authority and the validation of art, what occupies that space in the Japanese museum context?
Okay, I will just start by giving a brief response to the other museum models you've mentioned about.
Please.
In the Western concept. So it's all about like be more inclusive, more diverse, and to rediscover the ignored history. And certainly Japan also has a similar model, almost identical to the traditional Western museum model of collecting all sorts of artworks. But around the 1890s, when Japan started to learn from the UK, actually. So the government borrowed the model of South Kensington Museum, so the Royal Victoria Albert Museum now. They borrowed the system and wanted to learn, to become westernized and modernized. So during this particular period, the nation realized it was unprepared to gather all sorts of collections to fill a museum. So they decided to combine the format of a temporary exposition with the multi-categorical feature of a Western museum. So starting from this point, the Japanese museum system developed two models. So one identical to the Western museum model, and the other one is the case I want to talk about, the empty museum model, and specifically for the exhibition of art. And I think this definition of art is also really difficult to define because we talked about how to define contemporary art and modern art. So in Japan, the traditional Japanese art also divided into two main categories. The one is learned from the Western oil painting. So I would call it Western style art because Japanese artists paint these paintings. And on the other hand, we have the traditional Japanese painting, and the two have this fight during the 1890s, and they start their own art organizations, and they still exist nowadays. So you can see it's over 100 years of history. They're still producing this, well, traditional Western style painting. So if we understand it from the Western perspective, they still paint two-dimensional oil painting. They continue this history for over 100 years. And they occupied a particular space to organize the art competition and to discover young artists who want to have a career in our world. But they, in order to join this system, they have to follow the rules set by those traditional art groups, and to be able to show during the exhibition they organize that it is the museum. And the museum, in my discussion, is the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum. It's established in 1926. So the building itself is completely in Western style, and with this pillar similar to the Roman age, and it's completely empty. It has all the facilities we can see in museums like the modern days, the professional vitrine and lighting, and all these other facilities and meeting rooms, whatever. But it's completely empty, and it only offered its space to this old art organization to organize the art competition to select artists. This museum continued their practice until present day. And if you go to Tokyo, went to Ueno Park, I can still see this museum organizing these temporary exhibitions for this art organization. But on the other hand, the museum now have a curatorial team to organize temporary exhibitions. It still has no collections at the moment. So we have a curatorial team organizing temporary exhibitions. On the other hand, we have in these traditional art groups continuing their traditional two-dimensional painting or sculptures, and now they have the photography and calligraphy, something like this. They continue to say the traditional practices. This actually created a challenge for young artists who want to push the limit of the artistic creation. But if they want to have a sustainable career in our world, they generally be forced to join those organizations. Otherwise, they don't have the opportunity to present their work to the public. So in the 1950s, this became really a challenging situation. And those Japanese avant-garde, normally called by the Western world, Japanese vanguard who practice innovative work really in response to the Western avant-garde movement at the time. They trying to challenge this system which dominated the main exhibition space, which is the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum at the time. And during this period, and there are some more free independent exhibition also organized in the same space, also in the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum, which gave Japanese avant-garde some opportunity to actually challenge the traditional way of presenting art and creating art from within this same museum. But they found it's really challenging, and the space is still a museum setting, which creates a lot of limitations to how they will produce their work. If their work will cause damage to the facility within the museum, it will cause a lot of trouble. So this situation should force those Japanese avant-garde to explore further possibilities of artistic creation beyond this museum setting, and to escape, to challenge the old art organizations which dominated the museum space. Another interesting thing about this museum is it's the first public museum of art in Japan. So the Japanese like museum system, our museum system, actually start from an empty museum in 1926. And the National Museum of Modern Art only opened in around 1952. So you can see this gap. And the museum, Japanese art museum start from a temporary setting and only for the purpose of organizing these old art organizations and art competitions. So these organizations, so in my understanding, these organizations' rules and its exhibitionary format actually institutionalized the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum. Instead of the museum has its own understanding of collecting certain artworks, and based on these rules, they select what to include in their collection. So it's completely different, it's dominated by the artists. Because such, at least traditional organization was so powerful, which raises a very interesting question of how to understand modern art and contemporary art, because they continue their practice until present day. So should we define it as contemporary art or modern art or traditional art?
Yeah,
I think appearance is certainly traditional.
This is a really interesting thing, and something that, you know, before knowing you, I was not aware of, that contemporary art in Japan still has a highly kind of continuing life as a traditional practice and one that's experimental. But also, I think one thing that's interesting to think about within your roundtable discussion as well is how Japan still kind of has essentially this model of the museum that produces or articulates status or history or significance of particular artists through the exhibition, through kind of curatorial agency, as opposed to buying things. And also, I mean, just in a very speculative way, the extent to which, and maybe this is a question for everyone, the extent to which, if acquisition continues to be so central, and at the same time museums continue to try and diversify and extend their knowledge, the idea of maintaining collection might even become impossible because of, you know, limitations of storage. Because, I mean, essentially, if you expand the parameters for what should be acquired to a certain point, the whole system will become quite challenged. So maybe just to invite and to try and also begin to encourage you to ask questions of each other. And I might have missed someone's hand up. I think maybe Nikita had a hand up earlier. So I should make sure that she can ask her question too. But where, if people have a view on whether a museum can be a museum in the absence of the collecting function, or whether that is absolutely central to how we understand what a museum of art is. It's a bit of a broad question, but if anyone wants to jump in on that, that would be great.
I was just going to say that we might have to consider and reconsider how and where we situate the archives, because if we are continuously facing storage wars, capacity issues, then does there come a point where we can think about moving away from, you know, gatekeepers of archives and thinking about archives within different communities or regions? I just wanted to make that point. And yeah, I'll just let Nick.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to respond to Natalie. Natalie, are you happy for me to read out your message? I'll take the silence.
Yes, please do.
sorry the conversation has moved on, but I just want to add, museums reconceptualizing their relationship to knowledge and expertise makes sense, but it might be a mistake to say that movements for diversification of collections and history is a recent thing, right? Nikita quoted a Covina Mercer essay from a book about Black art in the UK in the 1980s. The Association of Art Museum Directors held a conference on changing the historical frameworks in American art in 1992, and the folks who were working in museums then are still working or still impacting museums now. So is there a conversation about accountability and vulnerability that comes hand in hand with reconceiving of museums as producers of knowledge? The answer is yes, 100% yes, in my opinion. Obviously, everyone's opinion will be different, but my opinion is yes.
One thing, just to say, when I said recent, I meant, I meant precisely the 90s. I mean, in the longer history of a lot of museums, there's an order in which they've prioritized how they diversify, and that normally begins with the USA. So yeah, but I'm gonna bow out.
No, it's all right. But also, as well to note, there was also the Whose Heritage Conference that was held in Manchester in 1999, that Stuart Hall did a forward for, which was thinking about this idea of Britishness and how we construct that Britishness and how it is not, it can't be untangled from colonialism, because the ones who decide what is considered Britishness are the ones who have long been in power and decided that the eldest thing that they have collected is the truest form of considering what we are today, and that needs to change. That was 1999. We're in 2021, and it speaks directly to what we were speaking about before about institutional amnesia. How do we stop losing what we've done?
Absolutely.
How do we stop thinking that we're recreating the wheel, or we found the problem? We know what the problem is. We've known what the problem is. Someone, Frederica, mentioned about the situation with CFCCA, and part of the project, the Future Collect project, contained a series of conversations of which Jack Tan was part of. And it was about how we can think of scoring policy, how we can use performance as a way to develop our policies and our ways of thinking. And that I'll respond to that question of that expanding collections, how do we keep expanding them? Things like performance are a really great example to look at in the contemporary fields, because performance is everything that we're doing now. In this lockdown especially, we are all performing on a daily basis. As a Black person, I am performing on a daily basis because I'm in an institution, I'm in a work field that origins have come directly from a result of something that I was supposed to be kept out of. And there's this sort of thing of when you own something, you have the choice to not let people in on it. You have the power to be able to shut people out of things, and instead of collecting things, physical objects, is collecting experiences and performance, and bringing performance into policy and decision making could be a chance for collections to still expand, but just in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice possibility, a really viable possibility, actually. Not to stop, but to just kind of redefine to sort of, I suppose, also to stop it being about the singular, the value of a specific and unchangeable object, and those values, of course, are not only historical but also financial. So
I had a question for anyone who wants to answer about I guess how you navigate long-held sentiments in positions of power that directly bat up against the opportunity to make change. as a trainee, I'm interested in learning from you all.
Can you say it again, Nikita? It's a question.
Yeah, what are some of the ways that you can navigate the way that people in power put up barriers for change? So thinking specifically, I guess we could, I keep saying the word use, but I don't know a more gentle way of putting it, but having the CFCCA as an example of breakdown in communications, I guess you could call it, because there was challenges to creating space for change because there is a hierarchy.
I can answer from project. Sorry, Eloise.
No, I was just going to say, I don't have an answer to your question, but it's something that I'm facing with my research, which is asking a lot of questions with being approaching why your museum is collecting this particular artwork. And it really varies from my experience, the answer we get from institution to institution and to which extent they are open or not. And yes, it's not easy. And so I'm very interested in knowing what everybody else here has to say about it. Sorry, Lucy, I interrupted you.
I was just going to answer because I guess the whole project that I'm involved in is about creating change in the institution, and I think sometimes it's like what might be seen as minor changes to the way something is categorized, or the fact that performance didn't have a fixed or didn't have a particular category that was shared across the database. So sorting that out so that we can pull out all of the performance works that are in Tate's collection and make them more visible, that's one thing. But so there's sort of little changes, but it seems to be that the way that it's been structured is about helping change. So it's having the right people in the room who make the decisions and hold the budget. So the structuring of the project, the advisory group has heads of departments, so the head of collection care, the head of learning.
Does the advisory group also have non-heads within it as well? In
the advisory group, yes, but it's more like the structuring of it reflects the hierarchy of the institution. So the way that something has, so if somebody, say Stephen in registrars, comes up with a problem like the length of Emma's title, he will highlight that as an issue, and then it will go to the implementation group, which is the managers of individuals in the project, and then they recognise it's an issue and then discuss it, and then it goes up to the advisory group. So it's like totally hierarchical decision making, but it's been designed that way because the person who set up the project has worked at Tate for such a long time. She knows that that's the way that change happens. But it is really, it's proved really difficult to make the changes that we'd like to. Yeah, there's lots of stumbling blocks and blockages that happen in the institution where, like the thing about the title is really interesting and really live, because it seems that the solutions that are found, for example, putting the title as an image caption or description, is unacceptable because the title, Emma wants the title to have as much care as the objects themselves. And thinking about her work in the last few weeks of writing this talk, I've realised that the titles are like a performance. They're like a prompt to do and make an action to do something. Yeah.
I just wanted to stress the point about accountability. I mean, this is the issue, right? And that's why you have these very public statements criticizing institutions and organizations. So you know, it's all very well knowing what the structure is and the hierarchy is, if that's the right word to describe it, but where's the accountability? And I feel that when an institution is receiving public funding, or is you know, using funds in some way that have been generated by the public, then that degree of accountability is scrutinized much more readily. And so there perhaps, you know, needs to be some reassurance, particularly thinking about people who are entering the profession, trainees, that that there's some ombudsman or charter or something, you know, something to capture that that essence of accountability, and you know, that because where are people going? They're resorting to these very public statements and public demonstrations. So, you know, it would be nice to think that there could be some sort of you know, cohort or independent body, as much as anything can be independent, that could kind of ask institutions to sign up to a charter, or say, well, right, this is as a standard, or this is how we expect you to behave or make decisions. But anyway, that's just food for thought.
I think it's a good point. I was just thinking that there's something really particular about museums and art institutions in that, in kind of, you know, museums, you know, they are quite involved in ICOM and these kind of like massive networks. Art museums kind of broke away in some way from that. And it's interesting to think about what the replacement is, because, and maybe particularly in a national context, because of course there are certain international museums that participate and lobby via CMAM, the sort of ICOM breakaway group for museums of contemporary art. So when there's an incident, you know, of self-censorship or whatever it might be, there's a kind of campaign there. But I feel like maybe there isn't such a clear space for bringing and connecting some of the discussions that you've mentioned, such as the CCCA in Manchester question, and actually having a forum for that is in some ways, you know, steering things in the right direction, that's recognizing what's needed, what's necessary for, you know, people entering the profession in terms of, you know, continuing support, development, mentoring, all that kind of thing. It does feel like maybe there's a need for that, and maybe it's something that is possible to put into place at this moment. I was also it's just an observation, and then I'll shut my mouth. But one of these things about the difficulty of change is also, I think, whether even large museums feel a sense of vulnerability and are fearful of models that are or have been in the past successful and sustainable, and that's part of the picture as well, is sort of a fear that can be kind of about individuals that have heavy responsibility, or for other reasons, that there is this kind of, for the art sector, given the public funding, you know, is sort of steadily declining, that there's also a lot of fear and self-protection involved. We've got a few good minutes left for you to continue the conversation. So I just want to invite you to keep talking, really, and raise questions for each other.
It's not really a question, but I was thinking about what Lucy said in response to Nikita's questions. And I think Stacey phrased it in a very good way. How do you navigate systems of power which might be blocking change? And from my experience, it feels like if you are inside the institutions, it's slightly easier to navigate through the system because you are inside and you know the structure. But as an outside researcher, I just feel sometimes that it's impossible to break this block and get inside, because there are certain institutions like to protect them, hide themselves, to protect themselves from being transparent. And something I also found through trying to understand museums databases, and what I find and what is made public, it's what museums decide to make public, and how can we improve that when museums also don't have enough personnel to look into reviewing the knowledge, as Uthra also said. Like, how can you make sure that your collection is well cataloged and available to the public? And yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Nikita, I see you have your hands up.
Sorry, I'll wait to comment. I was going to comment to the question that came from Michael Cook.
All right.
I'll wait until after. I just thought I'd put my hand.
I don't know, Lucy, if you want to comment on that, if you felt this difference between working inside Tate and work outside Tate, if you have had the experience in terms of accessing information to try to understand.
Yeah, well, before I did the postdoc, I was researching the ICA's history and using their archives, which are in Tate's archives. And I had much, nothing was redacted in the ICA archives. You could access any comments about artists' work or decision making. It was all there. But then accessing that similar kind of decision making around an exhibition or an acquisition at Tate, even from within Tate, it's much harder, because there's this protection around the sort of detail of the institution. So I've definitely found that, and I think when we've gone through the works that were nominated, I think there was something like 40 at the beginning. You have a trustee note for when a work is acquired by Tate, and that's a sort of summary of how it fits in art historically into the collection. And that's gone on a really long journey from the curators or whoever it was as initial research, and then it goes through the acquisition committee, and gradually that text gets adjusted, and then it goes onto the website, and it gets adjusted to fit into the kind of narrative of art history. But there's lots about the decision for why that work came into the collection that isn't recorded in the minutes. There's a sort of summary in the minutes, but the kind of opinions and reflections and the moment in time that those works were acquired isn't accessible. And I often find that those are the things that you want to know that you can't get access to.
Yeah, those are the things I'm looking for and I'm not being allowed to access. Yeah, thank you.
Eloisa, if I can say something about that, because
yes, please.
I have been in your position, and I'm at the opposite position. I'm inside an institution and outside of the institution. I think that this is a very, very important question. Transparency in how you access and reach information, and to what information you reach. And it has to do a lot with not only, national context, but the size of a museum. I mean, usually in a museum like Tate, it's much more difficult to access something. Whereas in a museum like the one I'm researching in Denmark, which is very small museum, there are no processes. I mean, you just go and talk with everybody and they're happy to give you access to everything, because they do not have time to research, because they do not have databases, they do not have, all these processes. In my museum, I think it's somewhere in the middle, but it is something that has very much occupied our thinking and our way of acting, because at the end of the day, it's what we're all saying about how public a museum is and what that means. What does it mean? A public museum, a public institution, not in terms of representation, but in terms of access to everything. And, you know, cultivating this sense that this is our museum, what previously has been said. It's very, very beautiful.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, how public is a museum? I don't know. Nikita, please, you have a question?
Well, it was just a response thinking about that. You know, how do we document audience visitor participation meaningfully? I think the same way that we should be working towards or moving towards documenting the things that we do in our meetings, in our, you know, wouldn't it be really amazing if, for example, I guess in the vein of Jack Tan's practice of re-performing or reactivating minutes and reactivating decision-making as performance. So the audiences are part of that process in some way. And reactivating is similar in that idea that we were thinking about with constellations at Manchester Art Gallery, because, you know, in astronomy, constellations were a way for people to figure out journeys or retell stories. Some histories can't be collected physically, some are verbal collections. They exist when we activate them as people, and audiences having a meaningful kind of interaction with performance or documenting anything. There are really great ways of thinking about it. Like, for example, for me, I'm really interested in this idea of looking to the way that Ira Aldridge, as a theatre actor, re-performs Othello, re-performs the story of Othello throughout his life, from when he's 18 to when he leaves the stage, and how theatre is re-performed year after year after year, and that's its contribution to the world, is that when people see it, when people engage with it, that is the collection, that is the performance's collection. And when people score performance, when people create documents that go along with instruction of documents to go along with performance, do we have to be the keeper of those? Can we give that part of the collection to people who come to the galleries to use it? Can people who then re-perform that be like creative exorcists raising the dead of the collection?
Thank you. No, that's very, very good points. Do you think, in terms of for transparency, would you consider, for example, you would think it's a great idea to use the technology we have now, for example, to record those meetings where people make those decisions and have those meetings available, even if it's just voice record, video recording, for example? Would you agree with that?
I definitely would. Like, maybe not video, in case people aren't very comfortable with being on camera, but audio for sure. Like it could just be like a podcast of decision making or something.
I would endorse that for sure. Thank you.
I just wanted to make the point of about evaluation and how that process is, archived or framed after a temporary exhibition. And it would be good to see how those reports are made available to the public and made a bit more accessible. And it kind of feeds into this idea of, kind of gathering the audience's reaction, participation, and thinking about Nikita's, ideas of performance and the performative. And I think it would be really useful if that becomes kind of a starting point, if you like, for the next temporary exhibition an institution puts on or displays. I just also wanted to make a point about the word art, because in non-Western cultures, the word art isn't readily and neatly translated into one word. So it could be translated into the arts, for example. And I just wonder how, to what extent, and how we can accommodate that space between the English language and the translation into other languages, because as we all know, in another language, the meaning is displaced or it's slipped slightly. So it would be good to think about that as well.
I am aware that I think we're due to finish, but also at the same time reluctant to stop the discussion. But Eloisa, how long is the break?
We have a 10 minutes break scheduled now. Shall we have a quick break?
Yeah,
and then we come back for an open.
Just maybe to say to people that over the break we'll be probably looking at questions in the chat bar, and hopefully you've got others as well. I think I'm enjoying how the conversation is moving towards this notion of a kind of radical transparency, and at the same time of trying to understand what the resistance, to that might be, because perhaps the fear is something without grounds, or perhaps it is. I don't know the answers. I'm not in the boardroom, but I'm enjoying that. And also the question that Utra just put about, the very definition of art is important, I think, on many levels, and especially, as you said, when you think about it internationally. And I know that, again, in Yang's research, this question of actually what art constitutes as a word when you translate it, and museum, and how the notion of art is sort of can be Japanized, as she puts it.
Yeah, I was about to talk about it.
Equally relevant. So maybe those are questions also that during the break others listening might want to contribute to. But as I say, so we ought to take the break in the interests of making sure there's time for discussion. But please, everyone listening, everyone who's spoken already, just continue to populate the questions so that these can be kind of looked at while we have our break. And so
just to add, after the break, I'll invite everyone, if you want to turn your cameras on and mics on, to take part as well.
Oh yeah, you can use your voice.
Yeah. All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes.
All right, cheers.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming back to the final parts of our event today. I invite everyone in the room to turn on the cameras if they feel comfortable with, and unmute their mics if you'd like to ask a question. It'd be nice to see other faces in the screen as well. There were a few questions during the conversation. I'm just going to refer to them, and then please put your hands up, your virtual hands up, if you'd like to ask a question. There was a question from Ellie Miles. I don't know if you want to ask yourself, but I can read it out. She was interested in what Lucy was saying about how curatorial knowledge is valued within organizations, especially in regards to acquisitions. And she was wondering if Lucy could say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of, what I've noticed is the difference in the curators have a much more kind of public profession than other professions in the museum. So there are certain aspects of a curator's work that are more publicly visible, like work on exhibitions. From a certain point, displays started to be authored, so collection curators got more visibility. It's quite interesting to look at when that comes in. But there's lots of work that curators do within the museum at different levels that isn't visible or acknowledged. So work on acquisitions is one of the areas of curatorial work that doesn't get much visibility. And then there's other areas of practice. So one of the things that the project is interested in is the kind of multiple perspectives that come into any kind of display or exhibition, and how you might not have the details of who was the art handler or who was the conservator. But those things could come into an exhibition's interpretation as well. So that would be something interesting to look at and create more visibility around wider practices and not just curatorial.
Thank you, Lucy. I don't know if Ellie wants to follow up with your question.
If there's no one of the speakers kind of following up on the question, I wanted to maybe ask a question to Yang Chen. I come from China studies and art in China, so I'm not an expert on museums or collecting, so I'll put kind of, my hands forward before asking the question. But I kind of know that in China, the collecting practices in museums sometimes give priority to the cultural and symbolic dimension of the objects rather than their actual materiality. In terms of what is more important sometimes is transmitting this tradition rather than necessarily preserving the object itself. And I know that in Japan, for example, like every 20 years, there's a temple that is being reconstructed so that the tradition, the building tradition is kind of transmitted rather than maybe like the temple itself. And I was wondering whether there are some kind of similarities or what's your thought about this idea of the cultural and symbolic dimension of the object over the physicality and materiality of it?
Okay, I'm not an expert with the topic and like a Chinese heritage. I'm not an expert, but as a Chinese, I know this planet is so big, and every day when there's a construction happening, it's possible to dig something new. So from the preservation part, there needs to be a certain standard to actually select those objects. They are old, of course, but they are not really historically significant. So you need to be really, really selective. And I don't know the temple you mentioned in Japan, and I can have a look later because I'm not really familiar with the architecture side. I'm more focused on how traditional Japanese art interact with other type of art. So I'm aware that Japan is really keen on preserving their tradition. I think it relates to the need to protect its cultural identity, because from the Meiji period, from the 19th century, when Japan learning from the West, it experienced the struggle of understand itself and understand the West, because during Meiji period, they considered Japanese culture to be less advanced. So this will create a lot of conflict, internal conflict. So at the time, the government dressed in the Western fashion, but Japanese people don't really understand why they do that. They are Japanese, but they're just in Western fashion. So this conflicts, I think, continued in modern Japan, and I also think China also experienced something similar to understand its tradition. Because recently the government start to realize the need to promote tradition. So they start to promote traditional festivals and try to minimize the impact of those Western festivals like Christmas or Valentine. And today is 20th of May. So in Chinese, it translates to "I love you." So there's a lot of event going on today because the English say the Chinese way of saying those numbers. So this conflict, I think, is going to continue in the future, and in the Chinese art world, I think a similar situation is also happening to those in Japan. The traditional painters are still continuing painting this traditional Chinese painting and calligraphy. But on the other hand, there's a contemporary Chinese art that become internationally well known. So how to balance these two type of art is really challenging. And I know like some of artists like should be introduced the work, like changing the Chinese character and combining it with English alphabet. And there's work, I don't know what they've checked it. It looks like a Chinese character, like kind of a corresponding to English words. So that's how Chinese artists, contemporary artists are doing to find the balance.
Thank
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess Uthra, I don't know if you want to maybe follow up, or like, I was wondering, because sometimes I feel like, how do you negotiate also like the exhibition and the display of or what I call like Chinese, or like, how do you say it, in maybe your case, South Asian, what it's, how do you say, how can you not reinforce certain established narratives of what people think about South Asia, and maybe with your work at the gallery in terms of textiles and
well, it sort of makes me think about the divisions or the definitions of invisibility, visibility, and hypervisibility. And I also want to draw a reference to an exhibition we did at the Whitworth called Four Corners of One Cloth, which was an exhibition on textiles relating to the Islamic world. And in that exhibition, we put on display textiles relating to the Islamic culture, not just the religion. But we found that some of the pieces that had been in the collection for a long time, there's one particular piece that was actually a fragment of the kiswa, which is the black cloth that is sacred and it covers the Kaaba in Mecca, and it's woven especially every year, despite the fact that that piece in the collection had been collected over 50 years ago. It had never been on display. And I think that was a reflection of people not having the confidence to understand how to display it, but also the context of how it was going to be displayed. So in that particular example of that exhibition, we were conscious that the collection that we held at the Whitworth was insufficient. It wasn't a complete picture of the Islamic world or Islamic cultures. And so we opened the exhibition by leaving two cases empty, and we invited people from the Islamic communities in and around Manchester to bring in their examples of objects, materials, textiles that connected to their idea of Islamic culture, the Islamic world. I don't know if you can hear me. Am I breaking up? No. Okay. It's just something's going on my laptop. And it was really heartwarming and refreshing to see that, because it allowed for a contemporary and an ongoing conversation of what Islamic culture is, because anyone going into a display looking at contemporary artwork relating to China or South Asia or wherever, it's never a complete picture, is it? It's an incomplete picture, but it's just a glimpse, I suppose, of what it can go on to be. And the wonderful thing that came out of that exhibition, Four Corners, was that one family ended up donating their Indonesian batik prayer mats. And up until that point, there weren't any prayer mats in the collection. And anyone going to an exhibition on Islamic textiles would think, where are the prayer mats? It's an obvious thing, isn't it? And we didn't have any. So it was really lovely to have that. And it was the way in which that donation came about was that the family who were actually relocating to Indonesia, they said, we're so happy to see our culture here, and this has been a gift to us, so we want to give this gift to you. And it was really lovely to have that donation coming into the museum, but into the gallery. So I think we have to be careful on who's writing the text, and also not to look to the curators as having all the answers, or to a curator from a certain community or a background as having all the answers, because they don't. I've got lots of anecdotal examples I could give you, but I don't think we'd have time to do that. But yeah, I think there's a real question between visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility, and it would be great to hear the other panel and the audience about what they think are the dividing lines, or how we can manage that better.
I think for me, all the way through today's discussion and from everything we've heard from everyone, the question I keep coming back to is, whose voice is amplified, who gets to speak? And again, even thinking about the public as a kind of homogenous entity, we've got to be really careful that there are the power structures we're talking about from above, but they're also from below. And you can navigate, or you can negotiate with communities or publics, but who are those communities and publics, and who runs those communities? Who's got the power within those communities? So I suppose, I don't know if this is a question or just me thinking aloud. I think kind of the idea of power just runs all the way through these kind of debates. I just wondered if any of the panelists had anything to comment on that. Thank you.
I'm going to comment on that. I think that you're correct in thinking about when you say like communities who you're working with. And I think it should come from your intentions as well. I think there's words used like low attendee, or basically people that you hope to engage with, but sometimes the programs that you sort of design for people ends up ticking a box for the institution and not actually being useful. As Uthra mentioned before about what family traditions she held at home didn't include going to art galleries, and you know, what is there for people who don't necessarily always engage with art galleries? How can an art gallery that exists on the border of, for example, the Whitworth, a university, a local community in the city, be useful to those three communities? Because you have like the university aspect of young students coming to the city who might not know the city, who might only be here for a short period of time and they're transient, but want to belong, want to be embedded. How can an art gallery or an institution support that aspect of students meeting people from Rusholme or Longsight who live around the border of the Whitworth, or engaging in the work that people do outside of the gallery, and introducing the gallery to something new that they might not have really engaged with before, like different ways of making. It's not just about the collections, it's about all the different departments. So the cafe, what sort of food are they serving there? How expensive is that? You know, can your local community afford to eat there for lunch? These are all really important questions in terms of engagement that go beyond collections and objects and are more people-centric. So I think it's really an institution's responsibility to be aware of the influences and social, cultural factors of the place in which it's situated, because it's building, it's immovable, but everything else is fluid. And that's where the opportunity lies.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Nikita. And just as an aside, even though I used to work at the Whitworth, I used to work at the V&A, if my mother did come to visit, and admittedly she would have to be coaxed, dragged kicking and screaming, the first thing I would say is, oh, I'll go and have a cup of tea in the gallery and have a chocolate bread. Oh, is it expensive? It's expensive. Venda. That's Tamil for no. So, you know, that's just instinct, isn't it? And it's a cultural thing as well. So I think Nikita is right. We have to think about all the ways in which a gallery can connect with its audience, not just in terms of its exhibitions, but the whole thing. And in fairness to the Whitworth, they are doing a lot in terms of food and the garden and changing the narrative. So
can I add something? I was just thinking in relationship to that point, and also the related point of like just how many regulations seem to prevent institutions from allowing people to bring their own food into them, which would be a really good solution for many people. Whether there's something, this problem is symptomatic of the museum specifically, or whether it's also true of other forms of art institution in existence, that they are not thinking about what those restrictions are, and perhaps the sort of absence, comparatively recent history of other forms of art institution that were much more centered on being owned by specific locations or communities. Is it a sort of art museum specific problem, or is it something that permeates art institutions more broadly?
My feeling is that it permeates art institutions. I think that the appearance of them and the feeling that they give off is very excluding if you're not familiar with those environments. Just thinking about the ICA, that it set up in 1948 and got a space in Dover Street in 1950 on the first floor of what was Dover Street Market. And it was a sort of, you know, a radical experimental space, but it was also quite really exclusive. So as one of the first arts institutions to have a sort of installation art and performance and mixed art forms, it early on was very exclusionary for a certain set of people. And then when it went to the Mall in 1968, that was a sort of shift in audiences, but I've got in mind some images of an exhibition called Art and Society, Society into Art, where Joseph Beuys did his blackboard piece and would draw out the interactions with people and throw them on the floor. And then that became this piece that's now in the Hamburger Bahnhof. But there's these photos that came up when I was looking into it of teenage boys running in and trying to chat and like pulling faces at Joseph Beuys. And you can see how irritated he looks. So we're having this sort of wild exchange. So he wanted to have a more intellectual debate, I think, than the children that were running in from St James's Park. Yeah, I think that it sort of historically has emerged out of this quite, minimalist exclusionary history.
And also, I mean, somewhere in all this, is it about one of the key things that distinguishes museums of art from other forms of art, from other forms of museum, is you know, the marriage to the market, which is very difficult to get away from, that somehow that is a factor in why art museums and contemporary art institutions might be less open, less accessible, is that there's really no getting away from how closely related the public and the commercial sector are.
I just wanted, can you hear me? Yes. I just wanted to make a point as well about new acquisitions and acquisitions coming into a collection and then waiting for their turn to be displayed. You know, this is another issue that we have to deal with, and because of the funding cuts, because of the shortages of staff, you know, the program is planned in a way that's realistic, but at the same time, you know, what a great shame it would be if new acquisitions didn't get their opportunity to be made more widely visible and known, because unless as an interested, curious member of the public you're going to go and look at the website and search for something, you're not really going to know about it, are you, unless there's some great big statement on the institution's website, these are our new acquisitions. Actually, that might be a good side heading, a tab heading, new acquisitions on any website, note to self. And so you could just, you know, you just have to factor that in. You want to see them on display, you want to engage with them, but we have to really just, I don't know, be mindful of the realities of the pressures that museums are under at the moment, but also maybe think more creatively, do things more digitally, do more joined up thinking between the institutions, you know, see if other institutions are doing exhibitions that could connect to acquisitions. And I know there's lots of loans that goes on between institutions, but I just wanted to add that to our discussion.
Thank you.
Do you think that there's a space for a permanent collection in every gallery that should be dedicated to new acquisitions?
That is a very good question, and I think that it is a problem because there is this habit of having exhibitions like new acquisitions. Museums tend to do that when they gather a number of works that feel that they want to show. They do this exhibition, new acquisitions, and there is this other thinking beneath that. What does that mean? What exhibition is that? What is its narrative? What does it want to say? Just come and see our new exhibitions. It's complicated. I mean, new media and website are great ways of you know, showcasing them, but it is something that has you know, has prevailed our practice. It is a problem. We have many times we have thought about that, and we have debated about that, about what's the point of doing something like that. But on the other hand, it is what you have said, Uthra, that people cannot otherwise, relate with them physically. And of course, in the case of contemporary art, you have the artists who really want to see their works on display. Otherwise, they feel, we were talking previously about how the audience and what is the public and how general this is. And one part of the public is the artists, the creators. And they have to be related, they have to be included, and they have to feel that this place is, is their home, is something very familiar and very, very close to them. And they very, 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 very often they feel that the institution, the museum, is something that fights them. It's something that doesn't include them, and this is it's very symbolic. It is very powerful. It's something that needs to be addressed, I think.
Thank you, Eleni. I'm conscious of time. We are running over slightly from our program. I don't know if anyone has any final questions or any final comments you'd like to make. This is your moment. Silence. I just want to thank everyone who attended the event today, our speakers, Eleni, Lucy, and Nikita, Yang and Uthra for coming to this event as well, and my wonderful co-organizers, Stacy and Federica, and Ashley as well for helping out with the behind the scenes during this morning, and of course, Isabel for moderating this conversation. It was brilliant. I think the main thing I would take away from this event today is, when thinking about contemporary collecting practices, is transparency. I think we all talked a lot about transparency and the needs for museums, art galleries, curators, and everybody involved in the process of acquiring an artwork, an object for museums, is to make this process transparent, to use, I think Isabel said, a radical transparency process. So we ensure that this is something that will, how can I put it, be available for everyone to understand how museums work, which is important, whether they are public funded or not. And rethink as well the knowledge we are producing within these acquisitions and what we make available to the public in terms of knowledge, which I think is very important as well. Isabel, I see you're unmuted. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Oh, Eloisa, I was going to put you on the spot.
Oh no.
Just sort of a semi-practical thing, but also an important thing, I think, is just, I feel like obviously we have a certain amount of time today to talk about these things, and there's a lot more that could be talked about in other ways, and just whether we should collectively be figuring out a way in which these conversations can continue. I know, Eloisa, you've got, PhD to write and all that. But I think maybe we can figure out, a platform, asking people to just write short responses or whatever it might be, kind of up to you, not me. But of course, I'm here to help. I'm in your service, but I just feel like that would be super productive, because there's so much that came up that I feel like myself, I need time to kind of gather my thoughts. So yeah. I don't know whether we should just leave people with this possibility that if you have, if you leave the event and you're going about your business and you have thoughts and responses, that we find some way of gathering those. I think that's always the thing.
Yes.
With events, there's always something afterwards. There's always thoughts that come up.
I think that's a brilliant idea, and I'd love to continue this conversation, because I think it's an ongoing conversation. There's never going to be an end to it, because new issues will arise about collecting practices. On the event website, I have there is a link with it's a reading list of some material that I've came across during my research. And I do encourage people who have other reading material to include in the comments as well, if they want to add. Lucy is suggesting a Google Doc. I will take the time to reflect, and if everybody is interested to, or whoever here is interested, please get in touch with me as well. I think the other organizers, and we can definitely find a way of keep this conversation going, which I think it's very important. And we are going to make this recording available. I have some ideas of perhaps turning into a podcast, which I will talk to everybody later on. But yes, that's a brilliant way of finishing it, to think.
Louisa,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There was a really important thing I wanted to say, which is that we needed to think about also the ecology of artists in the city. We didn't talk about that much, but that is a really important part of the triumvirate of audiences, institution, and studio spaces, to put people who might not know that there's an artist studio scene in the Northwest, which there definitely is.
Yes.
Audiences don't need to just go to galleries and institutions to be civilized. They can go and meet the artists where they work.
Yes.
But I just really wanted to kind of big up the artists and studios.
No, I think that's a brilliant point, because they're part of the system as well, or they should be. and I think it's a way of increasing your networks, right? You need to increase the networks to reassure that you become more inclusive. Yes. If anyone has anything else to say, we could just wrap up now. And I will thank you very much, everyone, for coming in today.
Thank you, Eloisa, to you.
Thank you, Eloisa.
Thank you for organising this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your days, and let's keep this conversation going.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Thank you.